Okay, thank you very much again for allowing me to come and learn together with you before a moed. And I'm supposed to remember to keep my volume up for Ezras Noshim. Please give me a comment in case I'm getting too quiet. Yeah, please. Tisha B'Av is about crying. And crying is not something that a person looks forward to, even though the Gemara does talk about the possibility on Shabbos of a person being able to have the cathartic effect of crying and it being something positive. But the crying that we experience in Tisha B'Av seems to us to be an expression of a punishment. Meaning, Chazal tell us, it's brought in Bamidbar Rabbah, with the Meraglim, when the Meraglim came back and they gave their report about Eretz Yisrael, Vatisa kol ha'eda vayitnu es kolam. Kol ha'eda, the entire nation cried. It's frightening to even imagine what that must have sounded like, right? That the entire Am Yisrael there in the Midbar. This is what's brought in a pasuk, Nosna alai bekola al kein snei siha, right? Their crying caused me to hate them, so to speak. Also kol shebechisim Garm lechem lios snuim, that made you hated. There was something very negative about that crying which was there that has to be defined. And then it comes with the following result. V'amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Am Yisrael, Atem b'chisem b'chiyah shel chinam lefonai. You cried before me a crying that was purposeless, that was empty, that was false, right? That it was for no reason. And therefore, I am going to establish for you crying for generations. From that moment, the Gezerah was brought out that the Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed. So that Am Yisrael will be exiled among the nations. Right, as the pasuk says, until vayisa yodolem lahapil osam bamidbar, lahapil zaram bagoyim uzarosam ba'arotzos. Right, it says that Hashem raised His hand, right, a lashon of shvuah, to throw Am Yisrael down in the midbar and to throw their children into the nations and scatter them among the lands. Now, I know someone that actually thought that this was a chinuch lesson. And he says, I do this to my kids. They're crying for no good purpose. I say, I'll give you something to cry for. And I said, I don't think that's what the Chazal mean here. Right? This is not a... So what is HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying? Again, I often quote Rabbi Chaim Friedlander says that the onshim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are never nekama, they're never revenge, but they're tikkun. Somehow here, this gezerah that Am Yisrael would cry would be a tikkun, would be a repair for the damage that was done by that initial crying. So we have to try to figure out what crying is, what's the negative form of it, what's the positive form of it, and how it ties into our Tisha B'Av. This, and a lot of this is based on things from Moshe Shapiro itself. The Vilna Gaon says that crying is from a lashon of mevucha. Mevucha means like you're lost, you're confused, you have no idea where to go. Right? This is what Paro said about Bnei Yisrael. Nevuchim heim ba'aretz. When they left Mitzrayim, it looked like they're wandering around. They don't know where they're going. A person doesn't know how to continue when he's in a state of mevucha. This is also why crying is not always done at night, but it's specifically for nighttime. Bachot tivke ba'layla. There's the crying at night. Svarim say that Laila has the same name as Yelala, which is one of the forms of crying, as you know from Tkiyah Shofar, right? That it's this kind of type of sobbing. The Gemara tells a story that Rabbi Gamliel had a neighbor, a woman who lost her son. Rabbi Gamliel heard her voice at night crying, and he cried along with her until his eyelashes fell out, right? And they said the Talmidim had to find a way for that poor mother to move further away a bit because he wasn't sleeping at night. So it was at nighttime specifically. Nighttime, why? He was crying, obviously he felt her pain, but what was happening was at nighttime a person looks at their own state of mevucha. at their own state and at the state of Am Yisrael of not knowing where to go, of not knowing what to do. Choshech, darkness, the Maharal says, is an idea of something preventing, right? Like it says, "V'lo chasachtos bincha." HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avram Avinu, "You didn't hold back your son from me." So choshech is a time when a person is prevented, meaning in a normal world of darkness, you can't go anywhere at night. You can't really do things. You can't really express yourself, right? That is a time in which a person cries because they're bumping into the barriers of life. They're bumping into these things. Lo aleinu, unfortunately, this year we're surrounded by so many people who've cried over lost sons and husbands and brothers, etc. So now, how does this bring us to the Churban, to the Beis Hamikdash, to Eicha? Megillah Eicha is a Megillah of Bechi. It's the Megillah of crying. It's the kinos. It's that which Yirmiyahu brought to express the pain of what was happening. It starts with that word Eicha, which Chazal connected to the question that HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked Adam Arishon, Ayeka, where are you? Now, Eicha, as we have it in our Megillas Eicha, is one of like wonderment. How could it be? Eicha yashva badad ha'ir abasi am. How could it be? Meaning, this should be an impossibility. This doesn't compute, right? This was the city of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This was the city that was full of Am Yisrael coming on Aliyah L'Regel. How can it be that it's like this? It shouldn't be. Similarly, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked Adam Arishon Ayeka, it wasn't a question that had an answer. It was really a statement, an instruction. He was saying, you have lost your makom. You've lost your place. You are now nowhere. A makom is that, the Maharal says, which gives, it's even based on Rashi, it gives something its terms of existence from a lashon of kiyum. The makom of a fish is in the water. Adam Arishon, his place of kiyum was to be Gan Eden. And here he had lost this place. And therefore that question, Ayeka, where are you? How are you? Right? And how can this be? Vayivku ha'om, when Am Yisrael cried, they lost their place as well. What happened? Originally, Am Yisrael was supposed to leave Mitzrayim and go into Eretz Yisrael. It was supposed to be a fairly quick trip. You can look at it on the map. It did not have to take that long. The ikar damage, so to speak, the Maharal says, of what happened with the Meraglim was they severed that connection. The Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim, the generation that came out of Mitzrayim, who were meant to be those who would settle Eretz Yisrael, were not. There was another generation, Dor Ba'ei Ha'aretz, who came. And the Eretz Yisrael that they came into was different from the Eretz Yisrael that the Yotzei Mitzrayim would have come into. How and why? Words are very powerful. Words are very powerful. And we see this in the halachas of Lashon Hara. The Chazal say such superlatives, in the negative sense, of the power of Lashon Hara, and obviously Lashon Tova in the positive sense is good, that it's keneged gimel averos, that Lashon Hara is, so to speak, comparable to all three gimel averos chamuros, avodah zarah, gil arayah, shvichus damim. It's words. It's not something that's hitting a person, per se. More puzzling is the fact that the Meraglim are viewed as one of the sources in the Torah for the idea of Lashon Hara. Now, Moshe Shapira asked something that I think has bothered a lot of people. It's bothered me when I was young, and I've heard the kids in school asking it. What is this idea of Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael? Right? If you want to say it's Lashon Hara about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that they said, Ki chazaku mimenu, but it seems very clear that they said Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. He says it's very hard to define, even with all the Chavetz Chaim's qualifications. Let's move it aside from Eretz Yisrael. Right, if I say, I lived in Miami a couple of years, it was really too humid for me there. Is that Lashon Hara? no issue to say that Miami's humid, right? What is it? What are you doing by speaking about a place? So he said like this. Moshe Rabbeinu sent the Meraglim to be Anshe Torah, to be people of Torah, to learn a certain sugya. That sugya was called the sugya of Eretz Yisrael. And he wanted them to learn up Eretz Yisrael the way he would learn up Eretz Yisrael. And learning it that way would make it that way. Moshe Rabbeinu did this, at least toward the end of his life, from a distance. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed him Eretz Yisrael, and he saw Eretz Yisrael both geographically and chronologically, Ad HaYom HaAcharon, and Chazal said every place that Moshe Rabbeinu looked at was now Chayav and Meiser. It gave it a status of Eretz Yisrael. It changed its status by looking at it, and even more so, by speaking about it. Here, when the Meraglim came back, and they spoke about Eretz Yisrael not as Eretz HaChaim, not as the land of life, not as the Mokom of Am Yisrael, which would enable them to be who they were supposed to be. They spoke about it as Eretz Ocheles Yoshveh, as a place of death. And then, when Am Yisrael cried, a cry is something very deep. A cry is not words, it's not a particular speech that you're giving. A cry comes from a person's deepest inner feelings. They cried, and that cry caused the Eretz Yisrael to no longer be the Eretz Yisrael that they were going to go into before. Now the Eretz Yisrael they went into was different. It was Eretz Yisrael al pi the pshat of the Meraglim. And it was an entirely different world. That was the damage which was done. So we see the idea of both Lashon Hara and the crying have something in common. Lashon Hara, Chazal say that someone who speaks with his mouth, it's more chomer, worse than a person who even does an action. Why? The example is from the Chet HaMeraglim. The Gzar Din of Am Yisrael in the Midbar was because of this Lashon Hara. It says, Vayanasu osi zeh eser pamim. Am Yisrael tested Hashem, so to speak, 10 times. That was the 10th time. So it goes together with the Bechiyah Shel Chinam. Bechiyah Shel Chinam means you're crying because you're crying about a reality that doesn't exist. And you're making a reality that shouldn't have been. That's the crying. That is the same power of what the Meraglim did when they provided the Lashon Hara that became the basis of that crying. They said things in a way which portrayed it, and therefore which made it into something that it isn't. They say a certain Adam Chashuv came to America in the early years of the 1900s, and he came back to a Rebbe. His Rebbe was the Chassid, the Churchkova Rebbe. And he was, as was common then, starting to make fun of like the ignorance of the American Jews that he saw, and the things that they would do. And this was common, even many people would write about it. It was a common source of laughter. And the Churchkova very strongly told him, I never want to hear you speak like that again. He said, that is one of the next stations for Torah in the world. Now, what was his hakpara there, so to speak? It's not nice to speak about American Jews, it's true. Lashon Hara applies not just to individuals, but to groups. Right? The Chofetz Chaim says that. So if you say all these things, Americans, French people, Ashkenazim, sorry, whatever it is, that can be a problem. But that didn't seem to be what the Churchkova was calling him on. It wasn't so much on the people, it was on the place. Because if you make America a place where Torah cannot flourish, it's a place of the death of Torah and the death of Judaism, so that also makes it a different America. That also affects it. Those people who did manage to build Torah in America saw its potential, despite all of the shortcomings, despite all of the tests. Those Jews who managed to hold on to Torah and mitzvahs didn't, like many Jews, view it as a place of impossible to keep Torah. We have to throw the tefillin off the ship when it gets to Ellis Island because it's not going to be possible. Those people who are able to see the things in that way, speak about things in that way, create a reality And that's why, I believe, he was so makpid on how people spoke about that. And so it is that a person is supposed to view every Jew in that way. The way you speak about a Jew that you see, you have to always see that potential. Right? After Tisha B'Av will be the Yortzeit of a Baron of Bells. And he was very, very careful. He never wanted to hear anything negative about another Jew. Right? If somebody would say something about Mechalei Shabbos, he said, you mean Jews who get mixed up between Sunday and Saturday? Right? Some people get mixed up at the end of the week, right? So they don't know. There were many things that he would see. There was the Talmud Rebbe told over from his father-in-law, Rav Weisblum, who was the Rav of Neve Sha'anan in Haifa. So at one point, the Belzer Rebbe came to spend the Shabbos in Haifa. So they were walking after Shul. Now, in that neighborhood in Haifa, there was a young man who had come from a family of famous Belzer Hasidim back in Europe. They were what was called the Yoshvim. The Yoshvim were those people who sat in the Belzer-based Medrash learning all day there at the Rebbe's beck and call at all times. So this young man's father was such a person. But he went in as a teenager to the camps. And when he came out, he was not keeping anything to the extent that he had a non-kosher butcher store on the main street there in Haifa. So it's after Shul on Shabbos morning. Belzer Rebbe's walking and people are walking along with him. And some Chacham decided to say, does the Rebbe know who owns that store? He says, no. He says, it's the son of so-and-so, the famous Yosef. The Rebbe didn't react. I was disappointed. He said, do you know what? The Rebbe know what he sells in that store? The Rebbe said, Zikalach for Yiddish Kinder, candies for Jewish children. And the man tried to say, no, Rebbe, that's not what he sells. The Rebbe held up his hand. He said, Zikalach for Yiddish Kinder. The Rebbe wasn't foolish. The Rebbe knew. But he didn't want to view that person that way. What he went through in the war hurt him, damaged him, brought that about. The real him would want to sell the little candies for kids in Shul on Shabbos. This is the power of how speech and sight actually changes the way a person is, creates a makom for a person who otherwise feels he doesn't have a makom. The kol bechi, crying is something which is real. Crying is something which comes from deep inside of us. And therefore, in order to fix the bechia lechinam, what is an idea of bechia of chinam? It means that it didn't have to be. There was no reason for it. It was not the reality that was supposed to be. The reality that was true did not deserve crying. But that crying brought about a new reality. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, therefore, I decree, bechia l'doros, and getting scattered out into the nations, what that means is there's going to be a process where you'll be able to cry in the right way. That your bechia will be able to cancel out the bechia of the meraglim. Your experiences through history and through Golus and through every place you go are going to bring about a bechi which yearns for that which is really true. Al eila ani bechia, ki rachak mimeni menachem meshiv nafshi. That which can console me and bring my soul back to me is far away, but it's there. It's the cry of yearning for something that exists, something that you now know, something that you now realize. Sometimes a person has to learn it by contrast. Sometimes the person has to go and discover, and Am Yisrael discovered this in many ways. We have to realize what is life for us and what is death for us. That was really what was happening in the argument with the Meraglim. The Jewish people sometimes get mixed up, and they think that those things that are our life actually bring about our death. Right? The Torah, right? Sometimes people view a Jew who's keeping Torah and mitzvahs, they'll say, you have no life. Right? That's how it's viewed to many people in the world, because those things which they define as life, oftentimes a Torah Jew can't do. I once had a student back in America, and he was kind of wild in high school and often getting into trouble, but he straightened out toward the end, and now he's a very, very well-known Askin in America, really an exemplary person, does so much for the Torah community. And at one point I met him when he was already a fine Ben Torah. He says, you know, if you would have shown me films when I was in high school of who I am now, I probably would have killed myself. Meaning, I would never wanted to live this way. I would have tried to stop the process before I would get there. Ad kedei kach, he said, I viewed this life as death. So this influences what a person cries about, who a person cries for, what we cry about in ourselves. So that's why Tisha B'Av, even though it's this day of crying and of darkness, but the darkness comes because there's something we're yearning for. The Geula is compared to the Ayelat HaShachar. Ayelat HaShachar is the darkest time of the night, just before the light comes. In that darkest time, a person knows that the light is there, yearns for it, is able to appreciate it when it comes. And that is when we turn things around. One tefillah that Rav Moshe mentions that he says that many, many people don't do, but it's there, and in some Sforim they call it the fourth tefillah of the day, is Tikkun Chatzos. Tikkun Chatzos is all crying. He says that is the essence of it. And you're crying at Chatzos because Chatzos is the time of turnaround. Chatzos is the time before the next day begins. Chatzos is the time in which David HaMelech's Chinor would begin to sing as the wind went through it, the Nevel, the Chinor, and it shows the idea of the new possibility that is coming. Even though now it's so dark, nonetheless we prepare for it. And the way to do it is to define what that reality is going to be. Chazal say about David HaMelech, Ura HaNevel HaShachar, Ura HaNevel HaChinor, Ura Shachar. David HaMelech says, wake up, right? My instruments, my musical instruments. Ira Shachar literally means I will wake up. I wake up in the morning. Chazal darshan from that. Lo ani meir shachar, lo shachar meiroti, ani meir et shachar. It isn't that the morning wakes me up. I wake up the morning. What does that mean? It just means he always gets up before dawn. It's nice. So I saw this Vasemis says the following. What it means is you can look at a day in two different ways. You can look at a day, if the day wakes you up, that means, what can I do? That's my situation. That's my limitation. I can't be who I would want to be because of the day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give me. David HaMelech looked at it differently. He says, the day is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's framework for me to be me. I come and I say, wake up day. I am coming to be myself in you. That's what changes it. When a person realizes that all these frameworks HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, through all the travels of the Golus, even the difficult ones, are to enable us to get out of that mavucha, out of that maze, out of that limitation, out of that darkness, and to be able to fully be ourselves. And that's something that comes as a result of everything that we do in those situations and in those limitations. Then a person is able to do and change what and where they're supposed to be going to. I once was with a group of Talmidim. We were kind of doing an unofficial tour of the areas of Yerushalayim around the Shuk, around Machne Yehuda. So at that time, the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva was still there on Rehov Yafo, and I was telling some things about Rabbi Levine, and there was an older man like standing, listening, and I could see the way he was like jumping up and down on his feet that he wanted to say something. I said, Shalom Aleichem, are you from around here? He said, yes. I said, did you know Rabbi Levine? He says, oh, did I know Rabbi Levine? He says, right, he came to visit me under the Jews and under the British. I say, oh, very good. People gave him a round of applause. I said, can you share something? Could you teach us something that you learned from Rabbi Levine? He said, many things. I'll tell you something unique. He said, I had letters from Rabbi. He wrote me letters. I have a relative in America, he's a big psychologist. And part of what he would do is analyze handwriting. I sent him a letter from Rabbi without telling him anything about the person. He read the letter and he said, this person is governed only by his conscious and not by his subconscious. Meaning, everything he does in his life is because he decides to do it. He is not a prisoner of the situation he's in. He is the one who decides, even if he can't change the situation, I'm going to do what must be done in the situation in order to express me. I don't know about handwriting analysis, but that picture of a person is something so powerful for what a Jew should be. We can't necessarily choose the situation we'll be in, but we can enable that situation to be a mokum for us instead of a mavucha for us. This is what Am Yisrael can learn to do in Golus. There's a certain idea, along with our crying, Chazal tell us in certain ways not to rebel against the Golus, meaning utilize it. Try to learn from it. Try to see. Try to bring light in that deep darkness, and then when you're able to get out of the darkness, you're able to go with so much light. I once came to Rav Avram Genuchovsky Zatzal. He's a great tzaddik and Talmud Chacham. He lived in Bnei Brak, but he taught in Yerushalayim in the Tribuni Yeshiva. And I got to know him when he was in Boston with a sick child, when I was still living in Boston. And I came to visit him once. I was going through a hard time. So I came to the yeshiva where he would be. There were a couple nights in the week he would stay in the yeshiva in a dorm room. And I came and I poured out my troubles. And I told him, and what's bad on top of this is that it says there in the Torah, that you're also going to get punished for not serving Hashem with simcha. So not only do I have all my tzaras that stop me from being b'simcha, I'm going to get smacked for not being b'simcha. So he thought with his goinish head, and he said to me, he said, Ataken b'simcha. You are happy. I said, how do you tell me that? So he says, I'll give you a mashal. Let's say I tell you I have a friend who runs really fast. And then I tell you, oh, he's running down the street now, go look. So you go look out the window, you say, he's not running very fast. So I'll say, you're not paying attention. He has a heavy pack on his back, 50 kilos on his back. If he can run like that with 50 kilos on his back, can you imagine how fast he would be without the 50 kilo? He's really fast. He said, you described to me that you're in difficult situations, but you're functioning. You're doing this, you're doing that. A person can only do that if they have simcha. He says, you must be b'simcha. You can't feel it because of that big pack on your back. But it's there. So Am Yisrael also are not able to hop, skip, and jump through the Golus. But the very fact that we persevere and that we do what we can gives us tremendous strength so that then, right, if we hopefully soon get to remove that back